All right.
So what is suicide?
Let's begin. Because we're talking about suicide tonight, I want to make sure that no one feels uncomfortable with anything we're talking about. So please feel free to let us know if we're going on a path you don't want to go on. It is a sensitive topic. But I'll begin by asking you, how many of you know of someone who has at least tried to commit suicide?
Sam.
Okay. Almost everybody. I'm not surprised by that. I think I read a statistic this past week that said 5 million Americans try to commit suicide every year. That comes down to about 1/3 of 1% of the population, I believe. So, pretty significant number. Actually, maybe more than that now that I think of it. In my calculator. Anyway, what is suicide? Of course, we all know what it is, but where does that word suicide actually come from? What does it mean?
Killing someone? Killing yourself?
Okay. Yes. We talk about homicide, right? Killing somebody else, but suicide is basically self-killing.
Yeah.
Okay. Pretty obvious. Killing yourself, and it doesn't say it has to be this particular way or that particular way. It's any kind of self-killing. It can take a variety of different forms. Some very active ones, like actually physically going and hanging yourself, or some more passive ones. What I mean by that is something like starving yourself to death over a period of time. You don't actually do anything. You actually don't do something, eat, in order to kill yourself. It can take a variety of different forms. The real question, though, that we want to get to is why people commit suicide. Any ideas why people would want to even try?
Well, if they're in a situation where they feel there's no easy way out.
Okay. Yeah, maybe you ever heard the expression before, caught between a rock and a hard place? Kind of like, whichever way you make a decision, both ways are bad, and so you feel like, well, I can't win either way, no matter what I do, so I'll just end it now. Okay? It's definitely a good answer. Anyone else? For reasons why?
Like clinical depression.
Yeah, there is an actual medical element to this as well. The rates of suicide are higher for those who experience depression than those who do not. But by no means do a majority of people with depression try suicide. That's not what I'm saying at all. It's just higher in that category than people who don't suffer from depression. Okay. Any other thoughts on why people do it? I'm going to read for you a little bit of information from a paper that I didn't write, that somebody else wrote at the school I was last at. And just a few of the high points from here. She wrote that suicide is a lonely death. Okay, this idea of being alone, no one else understanding, is very common. Often by someone who feels completely cut off from other people and even from God. There's a huge problem with if you live an isolated life. If you try to cut yourself off from friends and family and other people, that your risk for depression and suicide are much higher. And certainly if you cut yourself off from God in your relationship to Him, your rates for depression and suicide go up quite a bit as well. If you have any comments or questions as we go along, please feel free to chime in. Here are some common myths about suicide. I bet you've heard these before. These are things that are not necessarily true. Number one is that people who talk about killing themselves never actually do. In other words, you may hear someone say, "Oh, I'm going to kill myself." And you're like, yeah, it's just an expression. You don't really mean it, okay? But people who say, "I'm going to kill myself," are actually, at least statistically, more likely to actually go through with it than people who don't say such a comment. I'm not saying, of course, everybody who says that has suicidal thoughts.
Doesn't it depend on the circumstances
Oh, sure.
behind saying that, though?
Yes, absolutely. I'm just saying in general that you need to be on guard for when people say that. You know, someone, especially if you notice it repeatedly, if one of your friends is talking about killing himself or herself, you know, several times in a month, that's probably a red flag for you that, you know, something really might be going on within that person. The second myth is that suicide happens without warning. Very rarely is it just out of the blue and everyone's like, I can't believe she did that or he did that. Usually there's some kind of build up to it, whether it's some kind of clues that the person is leaving. Maybe it's very obvious that they're in a state of depression. Something usually happens, or at least the ones who spend the most time with them, and again, it's usually going to be family or good friends. They'll be the ones to notice these things. The third myth is that everyone who attempts suicide intends to die. You'd think that would be true, right? I mean, if you try suicide, you must be wanting to kill yourself, when in fact, that's not always the case. Sometimes it's done as sort of an experiment, maybe. You know, let's see how far I can go without actually going through with it. Maybe to garner attention, right? Sometimes suicides are attempted as attention getters. It's a really drastic step to take to get attention, but if someone really feels ostracized from their family or friends, they may just do something drastic like that to grab attention and tell, it's basically a cry for help in some ways, to do something like that. The fourth myth is that once you're suicidal, you're always suicidal. In other words, if you've tried it once or even thought about it once, you're going to have that recurring issue throughout your life. And while it may be true that it's more likely that you will have that happen again throughout your life, it's not necessarily true that it always will be. So that is a myth as well. Fifth myth is only the mentally ill take their own lives. It's not true. Even people who are in their right minds do kill themselves from time to time. Myth number 6 is that suicide runs in the family, that is, it's somehow inherited. And while there may be a genetic link for depression, possibly, to be sure, there really isn't any obvious suicide gene or anything like that you actually inherit from your parents. Okay? However, in my limited pastoral experience, and even when I was an intern, you do sometimes see that the child of a parent who committed suicide will commit suicide as well. I've seen that a number of times where there is a generational link. And I don't think that's a genetic factor as much as it is a learned behavior. You know, if your parent commits suicide, you may be more prone to depression than someone whose parent didn't commit suicide. Right? That just makes sense in general. Myth number 7 is that true suicides always leave a note. You know, that's not always true. You often hear about the suicide note, right, that someone leaves beforehand. Not always the case. Sometimes someone kills himself and there's no rationale, no reason left behind. Myth number 8 is that you should never talk about suicide with a depressed person because you'll give that person ideas. Anyone who's not living under a box, you know, will already have had that thought, more than likely. You know, pretty much everyone is aware of suicide, right? We all know what it is. So talking with a depressed person about suicide isn't going to make them say, oh, maybe I should consider suicide. You know, chances are they've at least maybe not thought about killing themselves, but they do realize it's an option for them out there, even though it's a bad one. So don't be afraid to talk about suicide with someone who is depressed, and of course encourage them to not do it. Myth number 9 is that all suicide is caused by depression. It's not true. A lot of it is, but some of it isn't. And the final myth is that if a person improves after a suicidal crisis, the risk is over. That's not the case. More than likely, something in their life is causing them to be despairing, to have